Welcome to session number 3 of what I have entitled our Substitute Sunday School while we deal with the COVID-19 restrictions. I've entitled this session Moses, Then and Now. When we were looking at the 7 realities of experiencing God, we were using the life of Moses. And in the process of doing that, we left off just as he had begun his journey of obedience. It was after the burning bush, after he returned home, collected his wife and 2 boys, and was headed to Egypt, looking forward to the confrontation with Pharaoh and the release and deliverance of his people Israel from Egyptian bondage. Now, one of our goals right now is to look at an episode that the 7 Realities Manual skipped. It happened just after Moses arrived in Egypt, but before he could seriously begin working in confrontation with Moses and all of the work that God had planned to display his might against Pharaoh. But so, what we want to do is to back up prior to that time, set the stage. But let's return to Exodus chapter 4, beginning in verse 29. We looked at this session last time. This is where we left off. So we'll begin there. Then Moses and Aaron went and brought together all of the Israelite elders. Aaron spoke all the words that the Lord had spoken to Moses, and did the signs in the sight of the people, some of the things with the staff, remember. And the people believed. When they had heard that the Lord had attended to the Israelites, and that he had seen their affliction, they bowed down close to the ground, obviously in a state of worship of Yahweh. So at that point, everything seems to look really well. Aaron and Moses were in God's will. They were doing God's work. They were doing it God's way, just as he had told them. They were doing it in his power for the signs and such, and they were doing it in God's timing. This was the time when God said, go. So what could go wrong, right? Well, wrong. So let's look at that stage that the workbook skipped. But to do so, let's back all the way up to Exodus 2. And in the travel between here and this episode we have in mind, we will look also at Acts chapter 7, part of Stephen's speech before he was stoned to death, and a segment in Hebrews 11 in the so-called Hall of Faith. Well, Moses had an early rejection, if you remember. We don't generally think of it as a rejection, just an event in Moses' life, but it in fact was a rejection. Exodus chapter 2, looking at verses 11 and 12 to begin. In those days when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and observed their hard labor. And when he saw an Egyptian man attacking a Hebrew man, one of his own people, he looked this way and that, saw that no one was there, and then he killed the Egyptian and concealed the body in the sand. So verse 11 says that Moses was grown up. But what was he, 20, 21, 30, 40, 50? How old was he? Well, he was about 40, and we can find that in Acts 7. Again, we're looking at Acts 7, starting in verse 23. This is, again, part of Stephen's speech before he was stoned. And here's what Stephen was saying. But when he, Moses, was about 40 years old, it entered his mind to visit his fellow countrymen, the Israelites. When he saw one of them being hurt unfairly, Moses came to his defense and avenged the person who was mistreated by striking down the Egyptian. Now, Moses in Exodus and Stephen here in Acts both agreed that Moses went out on purpose to observe his fellow Hebrews. Well, implicitly, that means that Moses definitely knew he was a Hebrew and not an Egyptian, even though he had been raised as an Egyptian. He probably even knew that he was from the tribe of Levi. And that's not stated explicitly, but it's an easy conclusion to draw. But the author of Hebrews tells us even more. Looking at Hebrews 11, beginning in verse 24 for 2 or 3 verses, it says, "By faith, when he grew up, Moses refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter." That's more support that Moses knew he was a Hebrew. And verse 25, "Choosing rather to be ill-treated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin, he regarded abuse suffered for Christ to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for his eyes were fixed on the reward." They're saying a lot about Moses that we don't see other places. But in verse 24, it says he grew up, as literally could be translated having become great. And by age 40, he would have been considered an elite Egyptian leader. So that's where Moses was. But it says he consciously chose to reject that. As a mature adult, he consciously chose to identify with his Hebrew brothers and sisters. And that choice was not cheap. It cost him dearly. Think of all he gave up by refusing all of the trappings of royalty in Egypt. I mean, he was raised in Pharaoh's house. How much greater could things have been for him? But now Jesus answered Moses' choice, in a sense. In Mark 8:36, Jesus said, "For what benefit is it for a person to gain the whole world and yet forfeit his soul?" So in a sense, the writer of Hebrews is telling us that Moses had an awareness of what Jesus was saying, that there are some things more important than all of the luxurious trappings, all of the influence that you have, all of the power that you have. There are things more important than that. And being a Hebrew, he chose those things. Notice that in verse 11:25, Moses' choice landed him in the midst of oppression. We generally don't think of what it cost Moses immediately. We think, well, he just gave up those trappings. But notice it says he was in the midst of the oppression. He wasn't spared the indignities levied on his people. He was made to share in their labors, and we tend not to think about that. We think of it, he's always outside, haranguing Moses, arguing with people. No, he was in the midst, making bricks with the rest of them. It's not exactly clear what verse 26 is referring to, but at least it probably is talking about the fact that Jesus identified with his people. He suffered for them, and he died for them. And so in the same sense, Moses made that same choice to suffer and go along with the fate of his people, the Israelites, rather than maintaining his influence and status as an Egyptian elite. Well, let's back up again to point where Moses killed the Egyptian. There are several points that can be made there. First of all, it was clear that Moses knew what he was doing, because it said he looked this way and that, and then he killed the Egyptian. His action was one of retribution, likely a reflex to his sense of the injustice being done to the man. As far as we know, Moses had no legal authority for what he did. And so from that point of view, legally, he took it upon himself to execute judgment without any due process of the Egyptian he killed. So he knew that it was an irrational, impetuous, ungodlike action that he took. And he took that in and on himself. But let's continue with the episode then, in verse 13 of chapter 2. When he went out the next day, that's Moses, there were two Hebrew men fighting. So he said to the one who was attacking the other one and who was in the wrong, he said, "Why are you attacking your fellow Hebrew?" The man replied, "Who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Who do you think you are, anyhow? Are you planning to kill me like you killed that Egyptian?" Right then, Moses was afraid, thinking, surely what I did has become known. So he performed likely a very illegal act, and he knew that it was not secret, that while he looked around and saw no one, somebody saw him. Well, the Hebrews' comment to him was really more like telling Moses to mind your own business, guy. This isn't any of your concern. But Stephen says it was a lot more than that. Back in Acts 7, verse 25, Stephen says this: Moses thought his own people would understand that God was delivering them through him, but they did not understand. Do you see what Moses was just accused of? Stephen says that at that time, Moses saw himself as the Hebrews' deliverer. In his own way, in his own power, and in his own timing. Moses saw himself as the deliverer of Israel, or in that case, the Hebrews, even though God had not given him any such instruction. He took it upon himself. But God's plan was not Moses' plan, rather clearly. It cost Moses the next 40 years of his life as he had to flee Egypt because Pharaoh, knowing what had happened, wanted to kill him. But as we return to Exodus 5 now, where everything has changed, he's now operating in obedience. He's in God's will. He's doing God's work. He's doing it God's way. He's doing it in God's timing. And Moses confronts Pharaoh, who's about to tell him no. We see that in Exodus 5, the first 5 verses. But there's something that we don't usually think about. And that is, here again, Pharaoh ordered Aaron and Moses back to the Israelite or the Hebrew labor. In verse 4 of Exodus 5 it says, Then the king of Egypt, which is Pharaoh, said to them, Moses and Aaron, why do you cause the people to refrain from their work? Return to your labor. So, starting in verse 6, we're going to see that the people are given the news that their laborers are about to be increased. Pharaoh essentially says, before you've made bricks, we got the straw for you, and you pound the straw into the mud, make the bricks, but now you're going to have the same quota of bricks, but you have to go find your own straw. So now the workload has increased. You don't hear much about this, but Pharaoh probably had good tactical reasons for doing that. Look at Exodus 5:9. Let the work be harder for the men, so they will keep at it and pay no attention to lying words. Pharaoh believed that it would cut down future protests and demands on the part of the Hebrews. If you keep them working, and they're under slave labor, so they can't escape the work, they don't have time to go out and gather and come up with protests and demands of their own. Furthermore, they had to go out and find the straw, which meant they were further separated, so they couldn't even just gather in their making of bricks. They had to scatter throughout parts of Egypt to get the straw. So Pharaoh was essentially taking an approach that would reduce the likelihood of protest, interference, and problems. Of course, we know that when that happened, things got nastier. For example, let's look at verse 14 of chapter 5. The Israelite foremen, whom Pharaoh's slave masters had set over them, in other words, there was a hierarchy. You had Pharaoh, you had several layers of elite under him. Then you had these Egyptian taskmasters, and they had Israelite or Jewish foremen under them. So the foremen, who were Hebrews themselves, were the ones who were supposed to be getting the work done. The taskmasters were just making sure that the foremen did their jobs. So it says, the Israelite foremen, whom Pharaoh's slave masters set over them, were beaten and were asked, why did you not complete your requirement for brick making as in the past, both yesterday and today? So now the Hebrew foremen are getting beaten because the quotas aren't being met. That means things are just getting out of hand. Well, I believe those Israeli foremen, I keep saying Israeli, there was no Israel at that time. The Hebrew foreman had made a tactical mistake and violated what any military man knows is a chain of command. The foreman skipped over everybody and went directly to Pharaoh. And we read, starting in verse 15 of chapter 5, the Israelite foreman went and cried out to Pharaoh, why are you treating your servants this way? No straw is given to your servants, but we're told make bricks. Your servants are even being beaten, but the fault is with your own people. Well, that probably didn't set too well with Pharaoh. And in verses 17 and 18, Pharaoh simply reiterated his stance and told him to get back to business. But on their way out from Pharaoh, where were the foremen going? They wanted to find Moses. Beginning in verse 19, the Israelite foremen saw that they were in trouble. When they went out from Pharaoh, they encountered Moses and Aaron standing there to meet them. So Moses and Aaron didn't know what was going on. They were out there ready to go. And they said to them, may the Lord look on you, Moses, and judge, because you have made us stink in the opinion of Pharaoh and in the opinion of his servants, so that you have put a sword in their hand to kill us. It's pretty clear they were blaming Moses for this turn of events. So what did Moses do? Well, something surprising that we don't typically think of Moses doing. But look, beginning in verse 22 of chapter 5. Moses returned to the Lord and said, Lord, why have you caused trouble for this people? He's probably thinking, hey, we were supposed to be deliverers. Now look at this. Why did you ever send me? From the time I went to speak to Pharaoh in your name, He's caused nothing but trouble for this people, and you have certainly not rescued or delivered your people. Moses blamed God for every one of these unexpected circumstances, even though God warned him that Pharaoh would oppose the idea. But Pharaoh's adamant rejection caused Moses to claim that God was responsible directly for this trouble, that God had failed to deliver his people from bondage, and that God's choice of Moses was a bad one. Moses was not happy. Well, it is clear that Moses' idea of deliverance and God's idea of deliverance were at odds with each other. At least from Moses' point of view, the timing was bad. It wasn't Moses' timing. God's timing and Moses' timing were obviously different. But Moses had forgotten again that God promised that Pharaoh was going to oppose all of this prior to the actual release. So don't miss this. At one point early, Moses' rejection was fundamentally the same rejection then as he's now facing. In other words, when Moses was doing things in his own power, his own way, his own timing, he was rejected by the Israelites, by the Hebrews. Now, he's doing everything according to Hoyle, at least according to Yahweh, and exactly the same rejection has happened. What's our one primary takeaway from this? Well, it's very simple. Being in God's will does not guarantee smooth sailing along the way. God had told Moses to go to the people, give them the same speech that he gave earlier, but this time Moses is going to find out that speech won't work. Moses, it's in chapter 6, verse 9, Moses told this, all that God had said anyhow. He said all of this to the Israelites, but they did not listen to him because of their discouragement and hard labor. It seems Pharaoh's tactics are working because now the people don't buy Moses' leadership. In the next section, we will move on with Moses as he gets beyond this second rejection and continues the struggle with Pharaoh, where we begin the series of plagues where God is taking on the Egyptian gods one at a time and saying, they're not God, I am God. I am not a tribal God. I am not the Jews' God. I am Yahweh. And we'll see that beginning next